there, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of A Lawyer and a Policy Analyst Walk into a Bar. This is episode 3 of season 6. We're calling this one For Our Eyes Only, and we're discussing freedom of information legislation in the Caribbean. So we're just going to get into exactly what that means. It's Delan and I, alone tackling this one today, but it's still going to be a good discussion. And as always, I'm the lawyer, Jadrick Cummings.
And I'm Delano D'Souza, the policy analyst. And like Jarek said, we're alone today in the studio. We're kicking a scene by ourselves. But we thought that, this is right up Jarek alley in terms of a legal topic that he can handle, that we can handle and dissect together. And so we're discussing For Your Eyes Only, freedom of information legislation in the Caribbean. And we're wondering because, of course, we know that in this region in particular, more so than some others, or even less so than some others in some instances. But the fact remains is that in this Caribbean, our democratically elected governments tend to try to hide behind this notion of, almost like a state secret kind of vibe, where they're saying, listen, you're not able to access this information. And quite often, it's very basic information, Jadrick, that they're trying to keep from the public. And that has really been, one of the main reasons why we've, been lobbying for the introduction of freedom of information legislation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's something that we have seen as recently as Grenada's election a few weeks ago. And I think that was a big a pillar of the NDC's of their platform and what they're running on. And it's something that, they've incorporated into the... Well, now that they're in power, we'll see exactly what they do about it. But they made a lot of references to the fact that I think in Grenada, the legislation or bill was passed back in 2008 and so. And, it's something that they've been harping on. We would see what would happen to CBI proceeds. You would see what happened to the shrimp farm in St. Mark's and so. So it's something that governments have been trying to run on and say that, look, if we are brought into power, this kind of legislation is something that you would see in order to highlight a lot of these areas where you don't get a lot of information, but where there needs to be information in any democratic society, like Delan was saying. So that's something that we thought we would look into and just kind of look across the region and see where those bits of legislation, where it exists and where it doesn't, the areas, the weaknesses, the strengths, the weaknesses, and maybe what can be done to help improve the laws in those areas, in those countries.
Yeah, definitely, Jarek. So for a democratic society, like we said, freedom of information is essential as its singular purpose to provide information freely, and it's really meant to improve the transparency at all levels. This allows for more frank and informed interactions with the government and, to keep them honest, to keep them accountable, to hold them accountable, and also to participate in the democratic governance in more meaningful ways. Because as it stands now, we are left often in the public domain making assumptions and saying, this is what we think is happening, either, behind closed doors or in terms of the government's decision, within specific ministries, within specific those state boards and corporations and so, where there really is a lack of transparency. Yeah. So the central idea and the common theme really is, in respect of freedom of information legislation, is to promote disclosure of information in the public interest, to guarantee the right of everyone to access this information. So there are some pieces of information that the government in our Caribbean try to keep to themselves, for their eyes only, as we call in the episode. They're trying to keep this thing for their eyes only, when really it should be available to everyone to view and to scrutinize. So naturally, this includes information held by public bodies or private bodies exercising public functions, governmental and quasi-governmental entities, as well as information held by private parties where access has not been restrained. And this sounds like a bit of legalese here, Jadrick, so I know if you want to jump in this little bit here,
Right, so I think when we get into the discussion a bit later on, you would see that there are certain things that across the board, the legislation has in place to say, okay, well, yes, we want you to have information, but there are exceptions. Obviously, when it gets to like state secrets, like we mentioned, there are legitimate reasons, legitimate expectations that, the government would have that this not be shared with the public. So, you're talking about anything that could, that threatens the security of the country, in terms of private bodies, there are certain things that you won't want to be exposed. And some in private, like the like quasi-governmental entities and stuff like that, even medical records. Obviously, you don't want the public to be
You
able to
don't
just
know
go and
how we
access
stop
anything.
in the region,
So there are
man. Say, boy,
exceptions
he had the sugar.
that we would see. I demand to find out, like, and I mean, you could probably see, like, some people trying to, raise a legitimate argument to say, okay, well, I'm interested in X post 90
What's
to find
happening?
out what's
Yeah,
going
yeah,
on.
yeah.
But no, there are exceptions.
Yeah.
So the legislation, quite rightly has in place things like that to cater to those kind of situations where you just can't get information willy-nilly about any broad area that the government might have information on. But when we're talking about the right to that information, we could see that there is a constitutional link to the right for information that's enshrined under the protection of freedom of expression in most of our constitutions. And that particular section, like chapter 10 in our constitution in St. Vincent, for example, which says, except with his own consent, a person shall not be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of expression, including freedom to hold opinions without interference, freedom to receive ideas and information without interference, freedom to communicate ideas and information without interference. So it's that part there where you have that freedom to receive ideas and information that we can see the constitutional link to that right for freedom of information that we should have. And that's something that, the legislation that bears in mind because there's that constitutional link. So you would see that all relevant Freedom of Information acts across the region, they will essentially allow citizens to effectively monitor the government's activities, like Delano was saying, in terms of, and there's a pursuit for good governance, right, and to ensure that the government is honoring its duties. And that in turn will allow governments to build trust and confidence with citizens, and it's something that's characteristic of any good democratic society. So that's something why all these
But
issues
Jarek,
have
it's
been
not a
placed.
free for all, though. Like you said, it's not a free for all. It's not like everything that's out there that the government has information to that you're able to access. And particularly in a digital age, we know here in Barbados and Jamaica, and so we're speaking about digital ID cards that are in the process of development and so on. And I mean, there are concerns about privacy, data protection legislation, and all of that. But I think what we want to zone in on with reference to all of this right now, I want to particular. I mean, you might have a different slant in terms of how you discuss the topic, Jared. But for me, I'm concerned about those elements of details. Those parts of that are in the regular operation of the government in particular, and the entities under the government's control. So I'll give you an example. Recently, I wanted some information from the National Insurance Services in St. Vincent and Grenadines and across the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, I was writing a paper on national insurance, unemployment insurance in the Eastern Caribbean, and it was literally like pulling teeth to get this information, because even when you did make contact with the persons, they're saying, oh, this has to go up to the top. Oh, this has to get, approval and so on. Oh, it's almost like they're channeling it up towards the top. And one of the issues that I have, particularly in small states, is that it seems like if some, very basic requests have to reach as far up as the Prime Minister. And I'm not afraid to say it, because, it seems like if certain Prime Minister don't give the say so to release certain information, although it really should be public, then it is that they're keeping it. And oftentimes what I've found, it's a reputational thing. It's politics at the end of the day. If we want to take it down this granular, it's politics, because these governments are concerned about public perception. They're trying to control public perception. And what's the best way to control public perception of you as a government in terms of the way you're operating? By limiting the information that is available to the public. And in my mind, and that's why we call the episode for our eyes only, because the approach seems to be by many of the governments in the Caribbean is that this information is for our eyes only. When we want to reference it, we'll reference it. So yeah, what I've found, Jadrick, is that our governments in the region have essentially been, hiding behind the lack of freedom of information legislation, to go about doing as they like. A lack of accountability, a lack of really, some central tenets in terms of our democratic system that are missing, because governments are allowed to continue and operate in this way.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at it, like I was saying before, it's something that governments have always or tried from time to time to use in their on their political platform when they're running for elections and stuff like that, because they realize that's something that citizens want, and they realize that's something that should be in place in a democratic society, like we've said. And the sad thing is, or the shocking thing is that there are just about 8 Caribbean countries that have this legislation either passed or in force currently. Those being St. Kitts, Antigua, Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, Belize, St. Vincent, and Guyana. St. Vincent being passed but not in force, which is something interesting. I think some years ago, when Delan was doing his PhD, he'd actually asked me about that, if St. Vincent is one of the countries that has that bit of legislation in force. And I think at the time, I might have told you yes, that it was in force.
But the reason why, if you remember correctly, Jared, the reason why I had asked is because I had several stumbling blocks. I was trying to get some information, and the government was flat out. He said, when I know the government, those persons within the government apparatus that I was reaching out to were either ignoring me or flat out refusing to give me the data. And so I said, listen, is there a freedom of information legislation on the books? Is it enforceable? Can I make an application to get this data that I need to complete my research? That was why I was asking.
Yeah. And exactly, and that's the thing, because you see, even in modern society or in first world countries, the way that it works is that if you need this information, there are freedom of information teams that are part of every ministry and so forth. That, okay, a request has been made, we're just going to look into it, right? Even before some legislation, they have a commissioner and a tribunal and all these things. Even before we get to that stage, just in terms of practicality, they have established just little teams, maybe 1 or 2 persons in a department, in a ministry, that can deal with inquiries about, anything to do with information of that sort. And interestingly enough, when I was, when we were planning this topic, I don't know if it is, Zuckerberg or whoever spying on me, but interestingly enough, TikTok video came up about a guy, a comedian. He got a parking ticket in England, and he was trying to challenge it. So they were saying, we got this picture of you, pay this fine. And he wrote back and he said, where's your evidence of this information? Please provide me with the evidence. I'm not just going to pay this fine. And they immediately wrote back and said, all right, we've sent your query to our Freedom of Information team. So, practically that's how these things work. But I think what you would see is that is a mechanism that's not in place, and that's something that we struggle with across the region, either because of our lack of resources.
It's nobody's job in any of these ministries now, really. Even within the national security apparatus, really, it's really nobody's job to field these questions about requests for information and so on. And so inadvertently it ends up dropping on some random person that it depends on where you've requested the information from.
Yeah. So even where this information is enforced and where we do have a tribunal set up and a commission and all these things, is just the lack of resources behind it to get stuff processed and to get applications moving. Because really it shouldn't, for certain things, it shouldn't even get to an application by a citizen to say, I need this information, I have to go through the Freedom of Information Act mechanisms to get it. There should be a team in place that can process this information so that you won't even need to get to that place. But when you look at the legislation that is in place or that has been passed, and the bills that have been passed, we see at least that.
So, sorry, that's a class. Those are the only countries those 8 are the only countries. Nobody else has it. No other country draft it. Nothing. It's just them. Just these 8 that you call.
Grenada, St. Lucia, they have bills in place. I can't remember who else. But yeah, they have bills in place.
But St. Vincent took. I remember we draft ours, right? We had draft ours.
We actually have we have an act that has been passed, so it's just awaiting proclamation, right?
10 years, anyhow.
Well, interestingly, that's the thing. So what I was gonna say was, back when you had asked me, is I believe I told you yes, right? And the reason is because we in St. Vincent there's a 2009 edition, right, revised edition of our laws. In that 2009 issue, it actually says that it's in force. So when I looked at that, when I communicated that to you that I was enforced, I was looking at that 2009 issue. That's the issue that I still use. And it says it's enforced. It has a commencement date and everything, 15th of December 2003, I think. But then there was a 2012 reissue of the 2009 edition, and that reissue has that it's a waiting proclamation. So I might be on our podcast, we might be breaking some news here, because even when, not to throw anybody on the bus, but even when you check House of Assembly in St. Vincent and ask them, is this act enforced? They would tell you yes. It came into force in 2003. Yeah.
Marby Shop thing then.
You know?
Who does a dog show? Dog show with cat starring?
So it's one of those things, because I've seen a lot of references to it. Like, if you just do a quick search across the internet about, the different Caribbean islands that have legislation in force, St. Vincent pops up as one of them. And there's actually a global right to information ranking. And St. Vincent is actually on the list because they believe we have it in force. And we're actually ranked, I think, 103 out of 136 countries.
Yeah. Lies and propaganda. That's all we're going.
But we have a good score too, because the legislation, even though it's kind of old.
If them only know.
Can you see what happened to these places? They get the information from questionnaires that they would, send out to maybe lawyers and other persons as well who, might not know better. So, but I have to shout out a colleague of mine, Chanel Hathaway, because we were actually discussing whether or not it was enforced. And she's the one who actually indicated to me about the 2012 reissue and so forth that states that it's now a proclamation. Because like I say, if you check House of Assembly, they would tell you it's enforced. And that 2009 issue. So there's some confusion in relation to St. Vincent. So that's why certain resources
and if you notice that the public officials have conspicuously not attempted to make any clarifications with respect to this particular issue, but we're gonna leave that right there because I want a lawyer letter. You see me? Come a lawyer the right here, so I know it will work.
Yeah, so I mean that's something I found interesting when we were coming up with this, when we were just looking into this topic, because but it's something that has come up. I think it has come up in our parliament recently that that the opposition brought up. How come this thing has been passed since 2003, but not yet enforced up to now and all that. But yeah, there we are. Like I said, we ranked number 1 or 3 on this thing, which is pretty good ranking. I mean, when you consider that, I think America is number 74, England is like number 42 or something. But interestingly enough, St. Kitts is ranked the highest in the region. Their legislation, I think they're number 19 on that list. And
their zone is actually enforced and operational.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware. Again, I could be wrong because of this whole kind of confusion thing with St. Vincent. But as far as I'm aware, it is enforced and operational. And it's a new act, right? I believe it's 2019 or 2018 act. So when you have those modern acts or acts that were recently drafted, then obviously they would rank higher because they have a lot of the sections and so that you would expect to see
newer provisions that weren't the older ones. As things have progressed. And I mean, surprisingly, Jadwick, as modern as we claim Barbados is, it's one of the countries in the Caribbean that does not have it, and glaringly so. We know, and it's something that's being discussed even now. This particular Prime Minister in office now speaks quite often about democratic principles and accountability, and so. And I haven't heard enough on this particular issue. I know that there's been some discussions on it, so I wait to see. I think I saw on Twitter somebody was discussing, and somebody said it's coming soon for Barbados, and I think somebody responded to the tweet and said, listen, they've been hearing that from Dyking Down Come. So I don't want to speak without authority on it, but it's disappointing. To say the least, and I don't want our listeners to think that our viewers to think I'm ranting, but this is a bone of contention. There's some issues in this Caribbean that really grind my gears. Inter-regional travel. I'm talking about the taxes in relation to that. I'm talking term limits. And those are the type of things that really grind my gears in the region. That we could do so much better, but our leaders continue to let us down.
And all things we've discussed on this podcast as well. You're right. I was looking for for Barbados on that list, just because they're usually up there in terms of new legislation and making sure things are in place. But yeah, St. Kitts has been the most recent, I think, and then Bahamas. I think Bahamas was in 2017, so they have a fairly high ranking as well because their legislation is new. But I think the first was Belize, and that was back in 93, I think, 94. So yeah, they were early. So as a result of that, their legislation might not feature a lot of sections that should be included. Yeah, so but
at least there were some first movers, and I think that's a problem that we have in the region as well sometimes too, where our governments put, previous governments put legislation in place, and they're first movers at that particular point in time. You're saying that Belize was in force for some time, but then it hasn't really been updated subsequently. And also too, I believe that some of these provisions need to be more out there in terms of the public, because I'm sure a lot of Belizeans and even Kittians might not know about their power under the these particular legislation, and they don't actually attempt to utilize them in significant ways. So I also think that in addition to just passing the legislation and actually enacting them, putting them into force via proclamation on, there needs to be public education campaigns surrounding what are your rights in terms under this particular legislation, what can you do, what is off limits, what can you have access to, what is the appeal process, and so on. I believe you're going to go into some of those things, because I know our listeners and viewers are going to want to know, what are the components of what are the components of a good freedom of information legislation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's a common feature or a common drawback, I guess I could say, that we've seen across the board, and that, like you've mentioned, it's a lack of awareness by the citizens, and they aren't aware of those exact things that you mentioned, how to even make an application, make a request, what are their rights of appeal, what information they're entitled to, that kind of thing. So generally across the board, and we see it happen with bits of legislation as well, but like you say, with Belize and so forth, that legislation has been in place for years, 30 years. So, and still, we can see that there's a lack of awareness and stuff like that. So those are things that typically need to be addressed. And hopefully it's something that we can see when there are updates and when other countries bring it in place, that they would ensure that there is an equivalent approach to ensure that persons are aware of everything that they need to be aware of once the legislation is in place. But typically, the main characteristics or highlights that we can find in these bits of legislation. Well, one, like we mentioned, there's a right to information. So you would see that a common theme, common thread is just a broad section that indicates that every person shall have a right to information, to access an official document that's entrusted by a public body. So that's something that we'd see across the board, standard. You then have to look at, okay, what is a public authority or what is a public body? And different bits of legislations, different jurisdictions would define it differently, but commonly it's your local authority, your a public corporation, any kind of quasi-governmental body like that, cabinet, things like that. So we get information. Those are the public authorities that it would speak to, even in embassies, consulates, things like that. So those types of entities. So when you look at what information can be requested, it's information from whatever is listed or defined as a public authority under that legislation. So some of the entities I called out there, those are some of the entities that are listed in the acts for St. Vincent and the bills for Grenada and St. Lucia, I believe.
So Jared, let me ask you a question then. You said the public authority. So the assumption by virtue of what you just said, or the assumption I'm making, is that all of the information within these public authorities are by default public, unless the government can establish that it isn't, in terms of state secrets and so on. Because from what you've said, I haven't heard a category. So you said public authorities, but is it that public authorities, their accounts, their financials are accessible, but other information are not? Are there categories listed in these legislation that say these are types of information that you're not allowed access to by default, or is it a process that has to be on a case by case?
Right. Yeah. So typically, it's any information that they have, any official document that these public authorities have, and there would be exceptions. So every act would then say, all right, except the following. So, like we were alluding to earlier, those would be things that there's actually an interesting one that I have to ask you about. But typically, we'd see the exempt documents be things like certain cabinet documents. I can't remember which exactly. I have to go back and look at some instance, but documents affecting national security, defense, international relations, certain documents affecting legal proceedings, and things that are, professionally privileged, legally professionally privileged. Like we said, things about secrecy, where secrecy provisions would apply. Things affecting national economy. Sorry, and that particular section was the affecting national economy. As I was like, I have to really ask Delano, why would there be an exemption here? And I think it's in relation to, obviously, there are things about there are subsections under that exemption in relation to information about proposals for expenditure and foreign investment in St. Vincent and so I could see why some of that might be exempted, but and certain borrowings that the government does or makes. But in respect of interest rates and currency exchanges, I was wondering if there's any reason why you could think of why that might be, that kind of information.
Well, in terms of restrictions and interest rates and so.
Right. So, like broadly, the exemption just speaks to a document being exempt in this act, and the kinds of documents that might be exempt under the section of national economy deal with documents relating to information about interest rates and currency rates. So I saw that, I was like,
okay. Well,
yeah.
So for interest rates, I mean, I'm not sure, but in my mind, I'd probably think in terms of some governments some borrowers might not want a particular interest rate known, or there might be you might engage in a negotiation with a particular consortium or entity that you're borrowing from, and they might have given you a specific rate that they might not be willing to give to other governments, and so within that they might be saying, listen, we're giving you this interest rate, but we might not want it out there in the public domain. I'm not sure. This is me guessing.
Right.
In relation to the currency exchange rate and so on, and even sometimes with monetary policy, it's different because sometimes these policies need to be secret until they need to be made. So, for example, if we knew in advance that the Federal Reserve was going to hike the interest rates at its next meeting and so on, before the discussions even happen, then persons could actually take actions within the market and so to benefit from those sort of that sort of information they hadn't known it before. So those sort of things are things that might, because they have implications in terms of how the economy functions as well. And that information sometimes has to be guarded until such time as it's appropriate to be released. Yeah, because there are opportunities there for persons to think. But that's just me off the top there, and that's actually something I want to do some more research on. Now that you've said so, it's kind of put me onto that as well. But I can imagine that those might be some of the things, because sometimes you don't want everybody know the interest rates at which you're lending at as an institute. Because imagine you give St. Vincent a preferential interest rate and Dominica no. Right, you might come and say, well, boy, that's why I give them fellas, and you gotta give me that. So I'm just, that's just me thinking out loud. But I'll do some more research in that, now that you've brought it up.
Okay. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I literally just saw it as I was looking through. I was like, interest rates, okay. And I just couldn't think of it myself. So I was like, wait, let me see if, let me straight to the line, see if you might be able to have a stab at it off the top of his head. But no, yeah, it makes sense, at least what you're saying there as well. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that we would see featured in the exempt section. So, like we said, anything that would prejudice security, defense, international relations.
But yeah, so I was gonna say, even though you've specified some documents, for example, maybe cabinet minutes and so on, those are obvious things, collective responsibility and so, because you can't know who disagree with the measure before it come out, and so there's some obvious things that you've put forward there. So then my question would be, you haven't, the list is not exhaustive. So is it then that you still have the right to make the application on certain things? So you in your mind, some persons might say, "Well, that's privilege. That's government information that could prejudice, like you said, national security or what have
Oh,
you."
sorry, you break up
But
there.
then, suppose I disagree. Suppose I think that it's not prejudicial to national security. Should I then make that application? And so I guess the next thing I'm going to ask is in terms of the process, and in terms of the appeals and that sort of thing.
Yeah, right. So basically, if you still have a right to make an application or request for that information, and to these obligated entities, and it's then up to them to determine whether or not that falls within a document that they can supply information about, or if they say, you know what, this kind of falls in the exempt category, we're refusing your application. Typically, they're supposed to provide, there's a time limit that's in place across the board, and interestingly enough, it seems to be a standard 30 days across the legislation that's in force or that's been passed in the region currently. So St. Vincent, Jamaica, Bahamas, St. Kitts all provide for a 30-day time limit in which information is to be provided after a written request has been made. So
has been made or has been received? Because when we start on the 30 day, when you get it, how I know when the 30 days start? Because I mean, if I date it today, that go back to what the law was, Jarek. I can't remember Miss Smith teach me of blessed memory with the postal rule. Yes, boy.
Postal rule.
I still remember a little bit of lamb, and I still remember a little bit of the postal rule.
The legislation would say after the request has been made. I think there's a feature in some of them that actually says, okay, once you've made the request, they're supposed to reply, as soon as possible, basically, to say, yes, we have received your request. So that you can know, okay, time starts to run from now. They've received my request, time starts to run. But I think typically they say after the request has been made. So, I would allow from whenever you have delivered it, basically. But typically, what we do with these things is to ensure that there's some kind of receipt or some kind of acknowledgement that they have received the request. So that's just good practice.
FedEx, man, I want to see like a signature there.
So we can see that there's that 30-day window, like we're saying in most.
Wait, 30 days, Jarek. That seems like that's a month, a month. If I ask you something simple, that's bro, a month you taking to come back to me. I don't even know which books you burning, which thing you hiding in that 30 before we even reach appeal, because we're going to the appeal next, I'm sure. But before we even reach appeal, you have 30 days to bury the body them. as the old people. So
I think they've probably, to be fair, I haven't looked at the legislation for other countries like say America and England and so I was gonna say that maybe it's just them being aware of how things usually are, the pace at which information usually turns around in these parts of the world. They say, all right, boy, 30 days, to go from somebody's desk to somebody else's desk to the right person who actually has the information. That seemed like it should be okay. But yeah, it is a long time, especially for certain things. I would imagine, or I would want to hope that if in a well-oiled, well-running system, that certain things, just be alright.
In the Caribbean,
it's simply a matter of doing a little email and responding and saying, yeah, this is X, Y, and Z. Like for the example I was giving with the parking ticket and so in with the guy in England.
I think the challenge for me with this, Jarek, one, I think it's like I said, I'm not a legal mind, apart from the postal route, which I still remember. But but I mean, I think 30 days is a lot, especially if it's a very basic request. Secondly, I think the challenge that we kind of create in these sort of instances is, in the absence of a formal, somebody who's responsible for handling this type of inquiry, how does it work? And then also I think to the nature of our public sectors as well, it's almost a thing where people are afraid to release information. And the mere fact that this request for information has come in the form of a under the Freedom of Information Act, that potentially flags that it's sensitive or potentially sensitive. So at the end of the day, instead of go make its way up the flagpole anyway, before any decision is made on that. Because nobody don't want to be like a clerk in the front desk who release information that the Prime Minister didn't want to release. You see me? So that's that's still gonna take some time. So I think the bureaucracy still has to run its course.
And it's interesting that you said that, because it's actually a modern feature in like the recent acts, I believe, in Bahamas and St. Kitts, which is also another reason why they have a high right to information rank on global ranking. And it's something that model legislation to update the older ones in the Caribbean, in CARICOM. That's something that they want to put in place with whistleblower protection. And it's for that reason, just because persons feel as though, boy, if I say X, Y, and Z, that's me day. That's my job.
You know how things here,
exactly.
you know how things be. I'm not saying it as not me. Nobody could say this come from me. And that's part of the problem we have in the Caribbean generally, particularly in the more, I don't want to say, let me say leftward leaning. I wouldn't use the A word that I was going to use it to describe certain governments. More leftward leaning governments where there is that fear, in terms of job security and in terms of, victimization and so on. So I think that's another aspect that perhaps we have to cover in a later part, Jarek, is, whistleblower legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. So it's like I said, it's a section that provides that protection in the more recent ones, but like in the older ones in Belize, Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Vincent, so that's nowhere to be found. So, but at least in like the Bahamas Act and St. Kitts Act, at least there's that section that says, okay, I mean, the intention is to bring some comfort to the employee that they can release this information and there ought not to be any retribution as a result of them releasing that information. Practically, I don't know if an employee is still going to feel comfortable.
But I think,
I think there's certain mechanisms in place to ensure that, or make it harder to be identified as the person who has provided information. But that's the whole aim and concept of it. But yeah, it's something that we probably need to discuss in a later part, just because of how important it is.
So we've gone through the process. I mean, I imagine you fill out a form online, you send in something physical, whatever the case may be. Now, let me say, I send in my form, I requested certain information as I have recently, and I had to make a stink on social media to get the data. And I ain't go back there. I had to make a stink because I wanted them data that them fellas keep jogging it. It took my month to get. And of course we don't have that legislation, so I had to go up on Facebook and light it up. I had to go up on Facebook and say, well, boy, this month I trying to get this data, and then after people start commenting it and sharing it and so on, that's when I really get the data. No? They could tell me that's not why I get it. There was I was gonna send it, but in my mind, I feel like if I never go up on Facebook, like now, so people still ain't right. Anyways, but given all of that, suppose I make the application, Jarek, and them fellas say, or the government says, listen, this is one, we're not getting you this information, it's privilege, it's protected under the act. How do I appeal that? Because obviously, I imagine, and I've seen a lot of cases. I remember, I think one was it Cayman Islands or TCI, one of those territories, British territories up there. That there was an application, and I think the ombudsman, the government said, listen, I'm not giving you all this financial information, and then it went to appeal, and then the ombudsman, I think in that case, said, listen, you have to give this information. What you've provided to us, to me, doesn't satisfy, to be exempted under the legislation. So you have to, and then I think in that case, and I might be wrong, they give them even less time to furnish the information, because 30 days done gone, you say, well, another 30 days after you deny the person. So I think they perhaps, if I remember correctly, probably said, listen, you have to provide this forthright.
It might have been the case, maybe on on a secondary appeal or something along that line. But when we look at that section, the appeal section, or the rights to appeal across the different legislation across the region, typically for the jurisdictions that have a commissioner in place that deals specifically with right to information, or an ombudsman, like you said, or a tribunal, then you make your application to that body, right? And then typically, what I should say is initially, which kind of even stretches the timeline out a bit further, is that initially a common feature is that there's first an internal review process, right? So
by the government.
So within the government itself, after they've rejected you, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to appeal this. As a first part of that, they have to do an internal review first. So, and most of them would actually lay out and say, okay, it has to be by a different departmental head. It can't be the same person who got the initial request, etc. So that different person, different team would look into it and then determine whether or not they ought to have granted you that information. If it's still rejected, then it goes on to the ombudsman, the commissioner, the tribunal, etc. So that's a feature that you would see. It would first, the appeal process would say, first, you must go through the internal review process where there is one. Failing that, then it goes on to us, to the appeal, the actual appeal. So the commissioner, in a case where there's a commissioner or an ombudsman, a similar timeline that we've seen in most jurisdictions, again, is 30 days.
Oh, because I'm not going to ask you, again, so this can't be the regular appeal thing where I languish in for my information for a year while the Court of Appeal or the High Court waiting to hear my thing. Can't be.
Yeah, so after you go through the internal review again, and the internal review as well, that has a timeline, and what we're seeing again is 30 days. So it seems to be 30 days. But so we've seen the internal review, that's 30 days. If nothing doing, then you go to the commissioner or that appellate board, and then they would decide again within 30 days whether or not you ought to have received the information. So an appeal to the commissioner, that's made within, so after the internal review, you have 30 days in which to make an appeal, right? And then the intern would then usually sit and conduct and give a decision within 30 days. And either party, like in the case of, I think, Bahamas, in their legislation, I think St. Kitts as well, after the appeal, after that decision is made, you then have either party then has...
Because I was about to ask, because...
Yeah, either party. You could then appeal to the Supreme Court within 45 days.
So the Supreme Court in St. Kitts is what? Eastern Caribbean Appeal Court?
In St. Kitts, yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
or can it go as high as
it might not be St. Kitts, but in Bahamas at least, yeah.
I know, because the Supreme Court is different. So in the case of St. Kitts, if you know, how that go? Can it reach as high as the Privy Council now?
No, I think it goes to, it stays at the High Court, I believe. Okay. I think that's something with in St. Vincent as well. So either party made an appeal, and the court under the legislation is the High Court.
Okay.
So they would.
I really like that because I got that in because I want to think these are so many things I've seen.
But yeah, so that again has a time limit, 28 days, 30 days, typical time. I think in Jamaica it was actually 60 days though, which was a bit longer than the others. But yeah, so that's essentially the process. In Trinidad, again, it's heard by a judge in chambers. And probably in chambers just because of nature information that you might be.
Because I was about to ask that. So most of them is in chambers then, because for example, with national security, that you won't want an audience for that. Especially how things are today, so most will be in chamber. So we've seen that. 30 days again, so 30 days for the application, 30 days for the internal review, another 30 days for the appeal, another 30 days for the appeal at a first instance, and then another 30 days again if I were to go. Well, then again, if I go on to the Supreme Court, I kind of lose control there then now, because then you have to be scheduled on the docket. I don't think they can prescribe a 30-day window for if you go
right, yeah, so right. So after you go above the commission and so forth, and it actually gets into the court system, then that's different. You're then subject to whatever timelines the court docket has, as you say, and so then it kind of
you could draw it for as long as it needs to happen. You know how things go.
Yeah, you lose your reign on it day, but I don't know. Do you even want to get to that point as a government body? I mean.
Jarek, you're talking about governments that region has privy council to settle minor disputes in terms of people's salary and thing, Jarek. Hold on. If this thing really, and I'm not saying you, if you as a corrupt politician, and I'm saying you, what I'm saying, if a corrupt politician were in a scenario where the release of this information could be so damning that they, and particularly to Jarek, remember, they're not paying for these appeals now, the state covering that. So it's not like if these appeals coming from my pocket as an individual, the state covering that. So I can take it as high as it needs to go, and I can take as long as it needs to take. And that's why I believe so much in terms of expediency. And I think even in terms that you wouldn't want it to go there. We wouldn't want it to. But at the same time, I'm saying if the secret big enough, you see me?
Yeah.
Them fellas carry it until the wheels fall off, bro.
Yeah. No. My mind wasn't even going there about about
Oh, you want to be
information that
nefarious,
craft
but that's
information.
oh, you thinking it's like about the thing?
Yeah, I think it's
no,
normal
no.
thing. Yeah.
I talking about the thing that them fellas don't want, you know.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
You're going all the way up to the top, my bro. You're nothing stopping you. Especially if election coming up. Tal. Even if everything can damage your financial, it can damage your reputation going into an election cycle. But we can't have that. That has to go on beyond, you know, Jadrick. So you know how these things go, man.
Yeah. No, you're right. My mind wasn't even going there, but you're
pure
correct.
heart, that is a pure soul. But you know, see this.
but no, I mean something like I was saying at the top of the episode is something that in Grenadian elections, that's what they were saying, like, you know, like what happened to CBI money, like we need to be able to get information, access to that, like exactly where it goes, you know, exactly, you know, how these projects are being planned, where the money from the proceeds are going.
And I'll say this, even in the case of Antigua, because I'm currently writing don't say that, I'm currently writing, I want them fellas pull my access, but I'm doing some work. And the legislation, the Citizenship and Investment, and this is a side note, it's supposed to mandate that the reports be published in terms of where the money going and so on and so forth. But even within that, there are ways to circumvent it. So at first it used to have like the check number, who it go to, the purpose of the check. Now they just have like very vague descriptions and so on. So when the reports initially, like, you know, when the CBI was first launched, you could get more information. But as things have gone on, you realize that it started to get a little bit murky. So even where there's legislation in place mandating that certain things be released, it doesn't prescribe, for example, the means in which it should be released and the level of detail that should be released. So there are all these kind of things in there. We know how government does use the state mechanism, the state apparatus against its citizens in many instances, and that's the unfortunate thing about it.
Yeah, so that's the whole aim behind these, you know, legislation like this, is to ensure that citizens are able to follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak, and see exactly where things are landing, where things are falling. But doesn't always work out. So, and you know, that kind of gives us a segue into some of the shortfalls that we see across the region, across the jurisdictions that you know that have it in place. And I think we mentioned one before, and that is the lack of public awareness. So persons aren't even aware that they can request this information. They can make an application. If their request is denied, they can appeal. Persons just generally aren't aware of the process across the board. You know, it's only those who take the initiative and, you know, well-informed persons who would be aware of things like this. So that's something that's a hurdle that they need to overcome. Something else that we've seen is just again, like I mentioned, I think the lack of resources in terms of an actual team or department that deals with freedom of information requests, and, you know, the resources that are allocated to them. So yes, you can make your request, and yes, there's a time limit, but practically, what can you do? And within that time, are they just gonna give you, you know, knock together 2 bits of information to say, okay, we've satisfied this request, you know, just because they don't have either the time or the resources available to find exactly what's needed in terms of the request that you've made, the actual information that you really want to get at. So that's another thing. So for the legislation that's been passed and implemented, you know, there are significant problems that we can see. So like we're saying, there's a lack of training as well. I think that's a complaint that was met in Antigua in terms of their act. Lack of training between staff and officials, and they were unaware of their legal obligations, what they can't do in terms of saying kits, and so they're aware, like we're mentioning, the employees are even aware that they have certain protections in terms of whistleblower protection and so forth. And we can see that there's this hesitance in terms of, I don't want to provide this information. So across the board, I think lack of training, lack of information internally and for the citizens outside, that's a common problem that we've come across or that we're seeing. So another area that we see is some issues with is in respect to St. Vincent, particularly, although it's not enforced, right? Just the fact that it has been passed, it's the lack of the limited rights of appeal that we've seen. So before, I would have been just discussing in the other jurisdictions, there's the internal review process, and there's a time limit for that. And then you can appeal to the commissioner, the ombudsman, or whatever appeal tribunal there is, and then you go on to the High Court. In St. Vincent, there's no internal review process, there's no commissioner, there's no ombudsman.
So who
It's
reviewing
just
it?
simply,
They're going straight to the judge?
it's just straight to the judge. And there's no time limit or anything for that. So while you could see the problem there,
Yeah. People go start coming down pan my country because I always say, oh, you think I think my thing is, bro, when you know better, do better. Because these legislation, I mean, I'll say that the 2000, this one was drafted a bit earlier. But I mean, as a lay person, which I am, I mean, I only remember the like postal rule, but as a lay person as I am, I could see why that could be problematic. So I don't understand why some of these legal minds, and of course our Prime Minister, who would have spearheaded this initiative, I think he was Minister of Legal Affairs back then. These are obvious problems in my mind that could have been addressed if they wanted them to be addressed, and I'll leave that there.
Yeah, so I mean, that's another thing. You could see that in St. Vincent, like I said, our act is a bit old, 2003. Jamaica 2002 around then. Trinidad is a bit earlier, but there is model legislation. I'm not sure if it's gonna impact Jamaica and Trinidad, but definitely Eastern Caribbean. There's model legislation that's going around to modernize and update this act specifically. So when that comes on board or comes on stream, or when we adopt it and update our act, then all these things at least should change. So that would bring in a mechanism for altering the appeal process in terms of first there being internal review and a commissioner being in place, or ombudsman, etc. And also bring in place whistleblower protection, those modern features that we're seeing in St. Kitts and Bahamas. So at least once that comes into play, then our act would be a bit more robust, and at least that would be good for us. Once we can get the practicalities down and have a team that's responsive, that's in place, responsive to queries and stuff like that, then it's the way to go, at least.
Well, I have a better idea. Yeah, the government could just be transparent and put as much information out there as possible to limit all of these requests for information, because sometimes these are very basic data, some very basic stats that as a matter of course, Jarek, these things should be released to the public. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that would be the first line in terms of making things better. Release what you can and should release, and then if persons still want more, then that's different. But the basic stuff, man, the low-hanging fruit, man. Again, like if this is all like if I run out your personal budget home, like if it's you understand, like if this is on your wife's pocketbook, that's all you're trying for balance at the end of the month. That's what this is. This is not your pocketbook. This is not yours. This is the public purse.
Yeah,
you get me?
That's the thing. That's why would increase confidence in your citizens. Like say, all right, this government is trying to do right by me, and they're trying to provide as much information as possible. And that is the whole basis behind this legislation in the first place, like we've said. So if you're willing and able to provide that information freely, then do so. I mean, there should really be something in place to force you to do it or whatever. I don't think persons realize the type of information that's hard to get. I mean, you would have some idea just in terms of when you're doing your research and so forth.
Generally, I'm asking for pass rates and thing, and pass rates and teacher thing. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, what's so hard about that? You get me? But
No, yeah. That's how it is. But I mean, at least I think I'm glad to see. I mean, obviously, more countries need to bring on board this legislation. I'm glad to see at least that they're the ones that do have something in place. That at least it's there. Not enforced, unfortunately, for some of us, but for those countries that do have it enforced, at least that's a good sign. And like I said, their ranking their global ranking is even higher in some cases than those first world countries like America and so forth. So at least I think we're headed in the right direction, and hopefully we can update our legislation along with the rest of CARICOM soon.
And actually proclaim it, man, put it in place.
Yeah. And increase awareness, like we said. There needs to be actual campaigns and drives to ensure that the public is aware of what's going on and their rights in relation to this bit of legislation. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's all we have on this, Delano.
Yeah. That's it. We overtime as usual. We like chat Noah. So let's jump right into the next segment of the pod, Jarek. We're drinking to this week, bro.
Yeah, so I am drinking too. I think Delano might have guessed it, but we recently wrapped up our carnival of Insimas, so I am drinking to a successful, a well-enjoyed Insimas.
We see that. We see what I like how yourself. I enjoy a jealous boy. See everybody. The place was rampant. COVID what? COVID who?
COVID what?
You know what I mean?
No. Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad to see it after 2 years. We're back. Carnival to me was a success. I believe the authorities might feel the same way. But I'm glad to see that everybody, personally diaspora and, tourists and everybody flew in. And I think overall it was a very enjoyable season. So I am going to drink to that.
Definitely raise
How about you?
I'm raising my glass to the outcome of Grenada's election. I'm glad to see that new Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell has unseated as Prime Minister. That is, Keith Mitchell, who's been there from we were small, Jadrick. Since I primary school, Keith Mitchell was 30 years there. Time for you to go. You know what I mean? I mean, no apologies for that. I mean, you've run your. This thing is not it's not a weight name, Jadrick. Let's call it now. It's a relay. You're supposed to do what you had to do and pass on the baton, man. You're there for too long. So I'm pleased that the people of Grenada have embraced youth. I think he's only 44. They've embraced new direction, new vision. I admire his call for things like ending nepotism and more accountability. Removing diplomats, for example, that are not Grenadian. All those things I welcome. All of it to say, I raise my glass to the new administration in Grenada, and I wish them all the best.
Could definitely raise our glass to that. And everyone, that has been another episode of A Lawyer and a Policy Analyst Walk Into a Bar. That's been episode 3. Again, catch us on YouTube. You can now subscribe, like, follow us, in addition to all your usual podcast platforms. Thanks for sticking with us. As always, I'm the lawyer, Jadrick Cummings.
And I'm Delano D'Souza, the policy analyst. Catch you next time.